As we saw earlier, no summer was complete without that delicious fruit of summer, the watermelon. And no watermelon story is complete without a bunch of boys trying to steal one from some hapless farmer's field. Mel Tharp recalls the time one farmer's endeavor to protect his crop of melons backfired in the Wahooed watermelon. I have never been able to fathom that strange affinity boys have for watermelons. Crisp, juicy apples and sweet, luscious peaches can rot in orchards and fall to the ground to become fertilizer for the next year's crop without so much as attracting the interest of a single freckle-faced urchin. Conversely, I have seen boys wade swamps, crawl through snake-infested briar patches, and brave thunderstorms to get at a patch of stunted, half-green watermelons. As a boy growing up during the Depression era, watermelon poaching was one of the few forms of petty larceny that was generally condoned as more of a traditional boyhood pleasure than a misdemeanor. There was a sort of tacit understanding that you were welcome to pick yourself a nice fat melon as long as you didn't destroy the vines or pull the green ones. Occasionally there would be some bucolic Scrooge who took whatever measures were available to ensure that there was no unauthorized harvesting from his patch. Drew Eves was this type of person. His stinginess was almost legendary. There was even a rumor, albeit unconfirmed, that Drew carried his wife's dentures in his pocket to prevent her from snacking between meals. In our small-town pre-World War II culture, R.L. Purtle's drugstore was an institution. You could get a milkshake for 10 cents, or, if you wanted to splurge, a malted for 15 cents. If you were broke, you could still sit and listen to the jukebox and socialize with your friends. Mr. Purtle tolerated loafers so long as they didn't create problems. By sitting around the drugstore, you could get some insight into the habits of your neighbors. I learned that Josiah Markey, who was a self-proclaimed teetotaler and preached against the evils of demon rum, drank large quantities of Hamlin's Wizard Oil. This wondrous elixir had an alcoholic content of 60%. I also knew that Ed O'Boyle bought huge amounts of paregoric. It seems that Ed, a local bootlegger, was adding this camphorated tincture of opium to his moonshine to create what he called homemade scotch. As for Drew Eves, the only thing I knew about his buying habits was that they were frugal. He would come in occasionally for a plug of apple chewing tobacco. Drew had a special hatred and distrust for anyone under the age of 21. He regarded boyhood as an objectionable, albeit necessary, stage of growth. It was often said that Drew would probably shoot half the boys in the country if it hadn't been for having to buy the ammunition. Friday and Saturday afternoons were busy times for the drugstore soda fountain. This was especially true during the summer months when we would get together to discuss our prospects for the upcoming basketball season. The drugstore was our unofficial social center. I suppose it could be said that I was mildly surprised when Drew came into the store that late Friday afternoon. If I was mildly surprised at his coming in while the store was crowded with customers, I was absolutely astounded when he plopped down on a stool at the soda fountain. "May I help you, Mr. Eves?" the girl behind the counter offered. "No," roared Drew. "You can't help me. I want to see Bob Purtle. I want me some Wahoo medicine. I'm going to Wahoo me a watermelon." The girl quickly called for Mr. Purtle. Robert Lee Purtle, or Bob, was a highly competent, no-nonsense pharmacist. "I don't understand, Mr. Eves," he said sharply. "Could you be more specific?" Eves stood up and raised his voice loud enough to ensure that he would be heard by everyone in the store. "I got me a prescription here for a bottle of croton oil. I'm going to Wahoo me a watermelon. I had some thieves get in my patch. I found where they cut up 2 of my melons." Then turning around, he addressed himself to the rest of us present. "I'm giving you fair warning, and you better tell all your buddies. I'm even going to put up a sign in my patch warning everybody that one of my melons will be wahooed with croton oil. Now, croton oil is a thick, unctuous substance obtained from the seeds of an East Indian tree. It is a strong purgative and works almost instantaneously. At one time, it was used extensively as a last hope laxative in cases of deep-seated or chronic constipation. It was frequently misused by practical jokers who found it easy to obtain under the pretense of administering it to livestock. Eve's strategy was obvious. He meant to publicize his intentions, then doctor one of his melons. If this warning didn't work, at least the melon thief couldn't say he hadn't been warned. That evening, Eves injected one of his melons with croton oil using a hypodermic syringe. The following morning, everyone passing the Eves farm was treated to the ludicrous spectacle of a 4-foot-tall sign erected at the edge of the watermelon patch. The sign proclaimed, in 6-inch block letters, "One of these melons has croton oil." All day long that Saturday, Eves must have had his chuckles watching passing farm boys glance longingly at the patch, then look at the sign and move on like ancient travelers avoiding a plague-ridden city. If Eves was in a euphoric mood, however, it would prove to be short-lived, for when he went out to look at his sign the following morning, some unscholared wag had scrawled in huge letters at the bottom of the sign, "Now 2 of 'em have it." The melons rotted in the patch. Eves would not dare to touch one of the melons for fear of getting a wahoo. No one would steal the melons, but they obviously would not buy them either. Greed was Eve's undoing. It seems it might have been a more judicious move on his part to put up a sign inviting everyone to sample his melons. I'm prompted to remember Norman Vincent Peale's assertion that a sign which reads, "Help us to keep the grass beautiful," is much more effective than a sign which reads, "Keep off the grass." The ritual of summertime was never complete without a good old-fashioned 4th of July celebration. Lou Venters remembers what an Independence Day was like in her hometown in 4th of July in Russell's Grove.
Our winters were long and tedious, and social events were few. That's why 75 years ago in the Blue Mountains of Oregon, everyone went all out on the 4th of July. The place for this big celebration was a 10-acre piece of land donated by my grandfather, Ben Russell, to be used as a community campground. Everyone in the area pitched in and cleared out the underbrush, leaving a big shady grove of tall pines and fir trees. The terrain was fairly level, and off to the side a good-sized creek rushed by, so there was always fresh, cold water available. There were plenty of downed trees to be cut up for firewood, and the road passed nearby. It was an ideal campground, and ever after was known as Russell's Grove. About 2 acres had been cleared off and fenced for a small pasture. Grandpa Russell always turned horses in to graze off the high grasses so that by the 4th the lot was ready for the games. First they built a dance floor under the trees and added small booths for soda pop, candy, and gum, and for fireworks. Over by the lower end of the pasture they built a small grandstand about 3 tiers high. On July 3rd, people started coming in from miles around. They brought tents, tarps, bedding, cooking utensils, camping equipment, and food. As each wagon load drove into camp, they were met with enthusiastic greetings from the ones already there. People came to live in these mountains from just about everywhere. Some were from Virginia after losing everything in the Civil War. One claimed he rode with Quantrell, so nobody'd better mess with him. Some had left the Mormons because they didn't believe in plural marriages. One man was a New York attorney, hoping to improve his health. Another was looking for the solitude of the deep woods. One who shall remain nameless was a pardoned killer who was allowed to homestead there. They all had one thing in common, the pioneer spirit and the courage to face hard times, hard work, long winters, and solitude just to scrape out a living. Most of our neighbors ran cattle, while others chose to operate a sawmill, flour mill, stage line, post office, freight line, blacksmith shop, hardware, and general store. They grew most of the food for themselves and their animals. They understood each other's circumstances and were able to draw strength from the knowledge that they shared an invisible bond of brotherhood. As in every big family, there were disagreements. Yet, when the 4th of July came around, any arguments were forgotten, and it was time for camaraderie and celebration. When each family picked a spot to set up camp, the horses were unhitched and turned into the pasture, while the kids and dogs took off for play. Only now and then was anyone called on to break up a dog fight. As soon as camp was set up, the men drifted off to the pasture, where the grandstand made a good meeting place. The women made the rounds of the other campers to catch up on what had been happening. The ranchers who lived close enough drove in each day, but half of the fun was in camping out. Everyone was loaded with food they wanted to share: cakes, cookies, fried pies, donuts, light bread, corn pone, fried or roasted chickens, chicken and dumplings, bacon, hams, venison stew, fresh trout, jams, jellies, pickles, and Lord knows what else. No one had to worry about food spoiling. All they had to do to keep food fresh was to put it in a covered kettle or a grub box and set it down in the creek in that ice-cold water. On the 4th, everybody was up early, eager to get the day started. After breakfast, the fireworks stand opened so the kids could get their firecrackers and sparklers. From then on, no matter what was going on, it was never without the bang of firecrackers. The least happy now were the dogs. To get the day started right, about 10 o'clock a patriotic program began using the dance floor as a stage area. First came the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, followed by recitations by school children, a patriotic reading or two by some from the local literary society, sometimes a flag drill, and finally everyone sang, "My Country 'Tis of Thee." After that, it was time for games and sports events, so everyone moved to the grandstand. They began with foot races for the little kids, progressing until they got to the ladies and the men's races. They had all kinds of races: sack races, potato races, relay races, three-legged races, and a tug-of-war, to name a few events. Last but not least, the men chose up sides for a baseball game. It was a hard-fought battle with a lot of yelling and encouragement from the grandstand. After the game, it was time for some cold lemonade, and then to supper. While they waited for dark, the dancing began. A guitar player, banjo player, and fiddler took over the entertainment for the evening. The scraping of feet on the dance floor, firecrackers exploding, kids yelling, dogs barking, people talking and laughing continued while Sweet Evelina, Over the Waves, or Turkey in the Straw rose and fell on the evening air, and the bittersweet smell of wood smoke drifted through the grove on the breeze. One year, just before dark, the men who had charge of the fireworks moved the boxes to the edge of the grove to shoot the rockets out over the lower pasture. Some of the people waited in the grandstand to watch, while others stood or milled around under the trees. When the dark of night descended without a moonrise, it was a perfect night for a fireworks display. The men shot off a couple of skyrockets to the oohs and ahs of the spectators. When they lit the third one, it misfired, and instead of shooting out over the pasture, it twisted around and landed in the middle of the boxes waiting to be lit. Well, all heck broke loose right there. They ignited a couple more rockets which started shooting in all directions. Some landed among the pinwheels. Then the skyrockets and Roman candles shot through the trees and into the campground, while the pinwheels raced along the ground chasing people like they had eyes. Pandemonium broke loose. Men, women, and children were running every which way, bumping into trees and each other, hollering, "Look out! Get out of the way! Stop bawling! I didn't mean to step on your dog!" The grove was lit up like a carnival until finally the last rocket and pinwheel did their bits and fizzled out. After the brilliance of the fireworks, the lanterns hanging in the camp shed a feeble light on this scene of confusion. Kids bawled, dogs quivered and whined. The horses had bunched and now pawed and whinnied until someone went out to calm them down. Disgruntled people gathered in little groups to speculate on what went wrong. When they found there didn't seem to be much damage other than a few bumped heads and stepped-on toes, almost everyone began to see the humor of the situation and decided that it had been about the most exciting 4th of July they'd ever had. Then came the 5th. The morning was spent in last-minute visits, the women exchanging recipes or patterns. It was the last chance for the men to discuss ranch problems, politics, horses, and hunting. They cleaned up the grounds, put out the last campfire, leaving everything in order. Then it was time to break camp, load up the wagons, hitch up the horses, and head for home, saying goodbye to many until next year, and saying goodbye to some for perhaps the last time.
I had a story in Good Old Days magazine one time about Perry Hayden, a Quaker miller from Michigan, who led an ambitious experiment in the principle of tithing back in the early 1940s. Soon after that story ran, Mr. Hayden's daughter, Martha Woodward, sent me a copy of a story about her father that was written by William Engle in the American Weekly in 1949. This is such an inspirational story that I wanted to share it with you. Here is the true story of Perry Hayden in God is My Landlord. In the lead was the Quaker miller, Perry Hayden. With him were 12 boys. Gravely, they walked down a street in the town of Tecumseh, Michigan, out into the open country, and in the corner of a field in the autumn sunshine, they prepared to plant the world's strangest wheat crop. They spaded and leveled a plot 4 feet by 8 feet, and the boys sowed a cubic inch of wheat, 360 kernels, in 12 little rows. It was the afternoon of September 26, 1940, and it marked the beginning of an experiment that today has worldwide significance. Bless this sowing, Lord, and make thy face to shine upon it, the Midwest miller prayed, and he promised to give a tenth or a tithe of the harvest to the Lord's work. He promised to sow the remaining 9/10, and from the second harvest give back a tenth, and so on for 6 years. The Lord did bless that sowing, and his face shone upon that little corner of Michigan. The urge to try the wheat tithing experiment came to Hayden in the text of a sermon preached one day by Cleveland Bible College student Clifton J. Robinson in the Tecumseh Friends Church. It was from John 12, verse 24, and it read, Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a kernel of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides along. But if it die, it brings forth much fruit. He decided to plant a kernel of wheat, then changed the plan to provide the first planting to be a cubic inch. And he asked Edgar C. Clark, manager of the 9,600-acre Henry Ford farm, whether he could have use of some land. Mr. Clark smiled. The request was modest. I guess we can spare a spot big enough for a cubic inch of seed, he said. Neither he nor the town skeptics foresaw the experiment's end. The first year's crop gave a hint. Hayden and his aides harvested 18,000 kernels, or 50 cubic inches, which was almost 3 times as much as the state average. The first tithe, Hayden said, was given to the minister of the Friends Church. He consumed it as a breakfast cereal. The other 9/10 of the crop began the second planting. From the second harvest, 70 pounds of wheat were threshed, and a tenth of it ground into flour for cookies served at a church meeting place in Damascus, Ohio. For a third planting, they had 63 pounds, a little more than a bushel. It was planted with high hope, and it was destined to become a test of the Quakers' faith. From the start, the crop did not do well. That winter of 1943 was hard on wheat in southern Michigan. It was cold, and there was little snow for a protective blanket. Hayden watched the growing crop sadly, but by that time Henry Ford himself had become interested in the plan, and preparations were made for a gala day to mark the harvesting. A sickle had been used for the first harvest, cradles for the second, and now for the third, Ford was lending an old Champion self-rake reaper from the Edison Institute. The day dawned menacingly. Rain threatened throughout the morning, but nearly 300 persons assembled for the ceremonies. Songs were sung, prayers were said, and Ford, pulling out a New Testament from his pocket, read John 12, verse 24, the text which had prompted Hayden to start the project. Then spry 93-year-old Harmon Russ hopped onto the old horse-drawn reaper, and the work began. It didn't begin in time. Some of the crop was bound and shocked, but a heavy afternoon rain caught most of it still lying on the ground, and this was Saturday. More rain on Sunday drenched it again, and before it was finally stacked, a cloud of birds swarmed over it as if dispatched by an enemy. In the end, that third crop produced 957 pounds of seed wheat, and from this a tenth was sold, with the proceeds, $2.67, going to the Cleveland Bible College. For the fourth planting, this left 862 pounds, a little more than 14 bushels. It wasn't as much as Perry Hayden had hoped for, but he didn't hesitate a moment to continue the experiment. Henry Ford let him have 14 acres. The seed was dutifully treated with Parsons seed saver dust, and workmen on Ford-made tractors and John Deere drills finished the planting in an afternoon. The fourth crop prospered. The seed was hardy. The weather was good. In midsummer, Ford, driving out to the shimmering field with Hayden, said, "I've never seen better wheat in all my life." For the harvesting, 2,500 turned out, and a day-long program brought eminent guests who included Governor Harry F. Kelly, Commissioner of Agriculture Charles Figge, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Ford, and Henry Ford II. Old-time cradlers bent their backs once more above a golden vista. Tecumseh women moved out upon the field in a great gleaners' contest. For the threshing, there was a pageant, too. Again a throng gathered. Ford lent historic equipment from his museum, which included a J.I. Case threshing machine originally sold to the father of Merrill C. Meigs, now vice president of the Hearst Corporation, and a Westinghouse vibrating-type thresher made in Schenectady, New York, in 1890. Meigs flew in from Chicago to operate the old Case engine, which ran a Case separator, and William Clark, vice president of the Case Company, went to watch the outmoded equipment still do a good day's work. Henry Ford mounted an old upright steam engine built by the Westinghouse Company in 1882, pulled the whistle, turned on the steam, and seemed as pleased as a boy with a brand new toy. Old-timers, led by David Boyd, 80, and Eugene Harris, 76, showed how wheat was threshed in biblical days using genuine flails from the Edison Institute. The harvest, after screening, came to 370 bushels. The tithe was sold and proceeds given to the Friends Church, and 333 bushels left for the fifth planting. For this fifth planting, Ford planted 230 acres, a battery of his tractors drilling the field. Again the crop did well, but Ford fell ill, and plans to hold a celebration at the field at harvest time were canceled. Instead of a field celebration, a token harvesting was carried out near the Friends Church, and later Ford workmen did one of the most spectacular harvesting jobs ever seen. 40 Alice Chalmers all-crop harvesters cut and threshed the wheat in one operation. 12 trucks hauled the grain to bins on the old Ford farm, and it took 2 gasoline trucks, 2 water tanks, and 67 men to keep the combines going. The fifth-year harvest was 5,555 bushels. The tithe, $861, netted from the sale of a tenth of the crop, went again to the Friends Church. That brought Hayden and his fellow townsmen into the 6th and final year of the project, and it brought them up against a problem. Hayden and his associates had 5,000 bushels of wheat and no land on which to plant it. And then Hayden said, "The Lord answered my prayers." Farmers from 5 states offered land to complete the project. the crop was sold to them, and 276 farmers, both Protestant and Catholic, planted the 5,000 bushels, each pledging a tithe or tenth of his harvest to his church. The following summer, 1946, the final year's celebration of the experiment was planned, with Governor Kelly proclaiming August 1st Biblical Wheat Day. The fairgrounds at Adrian, Michigan was chosen as the site for the program. Adrian businessmen, service clubs, churches, and civic groups rallied to the idea. Floats were built, the town decked with flags and bunting, and on the morning of the big day, a mile-long line of cars and trucks followed the parades to the fairgrounds. At the same time, from all directions, the wheat harvest in trucks and cars rolled in plump bags that were stacked by the farmers in a vast heap in front of the grandstand. During the day, 15,000 persons packed the grandstand and the track, applauded the entertainment features, congratulated their favorite wheat growers, and stood or sat in reverent silence during religious devotions. 2 old-fashioned stone mills ground 100 pounds of wheat, and a bright yellow helicopter took off with it, bound for the Lakeside Biscuit Company in Toledo, Ohio, which was to make it up in graham crackers and send them back. When the plane returned 2 hours later, 50 4-H girls distributed the crackers to the crowd. The celebration ended the public's part in the 6-year project. The wheat growers' accounting brought it to its official end. The 276 farmers that year harvested 72,150 bushels, grown on 2,666 acres of ground. The tithe, a tenth of the total crop, was released by the churches to the Dynamic Kernels Foundation. William Danforth, board chairman of the Ralston Purina Company, arranged for the processing of the wheat into a cereal, and the American Friends Service Committee distributed it overseas for famine relief. From that day, Perry Hayden carried the message for tithing up and down the country. He gave almost all his time to it, speaking in churches and civic centers. A 45-minute film, God is My Landlord, showing the steps in the wheat project from first to last, was produced and distributed. Hayden said, "Everywhere, people in every walk of life are accepting the tithing principle. The Lord looks on tithers with favor."